HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Age of Caesar, 5 Roman Lives, by Plutarch, translated by Pamela Mensch and James Rom, read by Michael Page. Preface. James Rom. By 31 BCE, after serving as a battleground for Rome's civil wars for more than a decade, the cities of mainland Greece were exhausted and starving. In rapid succession, the great generals and political leaders of the age, Pompey, Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Octavian, had despoiled the region's food stocks to feed Roman troops. Finally, in flight from Greece after his defeat at the Battle of Actium, Mark Antony tried to extract one more shipment of grain from the citizens of Chaeronea, the smallish city-state in Boeotia near the oracular site of Delphi. Greeks who lived there were whipped by Antony's soldiers as they carried loads of grain across nearly 20 miles of rough terrain to the Gulf of Corinth, where the retreating ships of Antony and his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, were waiting. Among those pressed into this ignominious service was one Nicarchus, the great-grandfather of Plutarch. They had made one trip of this kind, and when the second load had been measured out and they were about to put it on their shoulders, news came that Antony had been defeated, and this saved the city. For Antony's stewards and soldiers immediately fled, and the citizens divided the grain among themselves. Plutarch records in Antony, perhaps recalling what he himself had heard as a child at his great-grandfather's knee. The episode has little historical importance, but it is the one direct link Plutarch makes between his own experience and the events of the age of Caesar, roughly speaking the middle third of the 1st century BCE, the era that saw the rise to power of Julius Caesar, his murder on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, and the subsequent wars among those seeking to claim or eradicate his legacy. The world was a quieter place by the time Plutarch was old enough to understand his great-grandfather's tales. Born around 45 CE, almost a century after Caesar's assassination, Plutarch grew up in the Greek province of a Roman state that had resolved its internal quarrels and subdued nearly all its foes. His life in Chaeronea was untroubled by the depredations of Roman armies. The era of Nicarchus' youth, in which much of the world had been caught up in the rivalries of towering generals, must have seemed far off. Yet it was that era, and the similarly turbulent era 3 centuries earlier, that had seen the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, to which Plutarch gave the most attention in his Parallel Lives, the collection of historical biographies for which he is best known today. The Age of Caesar furnished him with 5 of his longest and most compelling lives, superb illustrations of the thesis that governs the collection as a whole, that character, the endlessly varied contours of the human soul, shapes not only destiny for the individual, as a famous Greek maxim maintained, but the history of nations as well. As a well-off, intelligent youth studying philosophy at Athens under a teacher named Ammonius, Plutarch had glimpses of the great imperial power that resided in far-off Rome. In the late 60s CE, when Plutarch was in his 20s, Emperor Nero, pursuing the delusion of a singing career, came sweeping through Greece on a concert tour, and the Greeks prostrated themselves before him, even posting an honorary inscription on the pediment of the Parthenon. In 68 and 69, after Nero died without an heir, the Greek world watched nervously as 4 rivals battled for succession, resulting in a victory for Vespasian, the founder of the Flavian dynasty. This brief taste of civil war, after a full century of Julio-Claudian rule, served to remind the world governed by Rome of how much was at stake in the stability of its government. It was a lesson Plutarch kept firmly in mind when he later wrote about the far worse civil wars of the age of Caesar. Unlike others who wrote about those wars, the Roman poet Lucan, already dead by this time, had been a contemporary, Plutarch never questioned the legitimacy of the political system that they had produced, the autocracy today known as the Principate, because its rulers were euphemistically dubbed princeps, first citizen, rather than emperor. Probably during his years in Athens, Plutarch became acquainted with Quintus Socius Senecio, a high Roman official then governing Greece, who later twice rose to the pinnacle of Roman politics, the consulship. The two men developed a warm bond based on pursuit of shared philosophic goals, and Plutarch ultimately addressed to Senecio his parallel lives, as well as two of his non-biographical essays. Another powerful Roman, a senator named Lucius Mestrius Florus, later helped Plutarch obtain Roman citizenship, and Plutarch thereafter adopted the man's first and middle name as part of his own. Florus, too, would later become consul, a second among the 9 Romans of consular rank whom Plutarch counted as personal friends. This collegiality with Roman men of affairs says much about Plutarch's breadth and temperament. Not covetous of power himself, he felt at ease with those who were. He no doubt shared with them many dinner parties of the kind he represents in his table talk, where learned conversation flowed freely in Greek, for Plutarch learned Latin only late in life. At some point, probably when Plutarch was in his late 20s or early 30s, official business brought him to Rome, the first of several visits he would make over the next 2 decades. Greek intellectuals were highly sought after there as lecturers and moral preceptors, and Plutarch's talents soon gained him an audience. Important men, including Arulinus Rusticus, another future consul, listened as Plutarch discoursed in Greek on ethical topics. At Rome at this time, the teachings of Stoicism, and to a lesser degree Epicureanism, provided the dominant ethical models for upper-class intellectuals in search of the good life. But Plutarch preferred the less earthbound system devised by Plato and revised by his followers over the course of 5 intervening centuries. Indeed, several of his ethical writings take the form of dialogues, in imitation of the works of Plato, or mount defences of the Platonic system or attacks on rival schools. These philosophic dialogues and essays later got lumped together during the Middle Ages with Plutarch's various other non-biographical works, rhetorical exercises, antiquarian miscellanies, and personal reflections on family life, education, and proprieties of thought and behaviour, into a vast collection called the Moralia. This anthology is just as voluminous as the Lives, and would be much larger if all of Plutarch's writings had survived. Evidence suggests that he wrote many more works than the 78 grouped today under the heading Moralia, a few of which are almost certainly the work of other unknown authors. It's an uneven collection, encompassing lively works that still bear close reading, along with others that today feel stale, stiff, or dated. But it has had enormous influence over time, providing a model for modern moral essayists, including Montaigne and Emerson. It's difficult to date any of Plutarch's writings absolutely or to establish their sequence, but it seems likely that most of the treatises in the Moralia precede the parallel lives. Indeed, one essay in the collection seems to show that while Plutarch had not yet begun writing biography, he was thinking about the ethical possibilities the genre offered. In a work that taught how to measure one's progress toward virtue, Plutarch tells his addressee, Senecio, that those striving for moral betterment should set before their eyes those who are good or who have been so, and ponder what would Plato have done in this situation. What would Epaminondas have said? How would Lycurgus or Agesilaus have appeared? And just as if looking in a mirror, compose themselves differently, or change some mode of speech that is unworthy of themselves, or resist some strong emotion. The thought and recollection of good men instantly comes to mind, and keeps upright those striving toward virtue, preventing their falls. The passage seems to anticipate the project that still lay ahead for Plutarch, the parallel lives, especially when we consider that 3 of the 4 inspirational models here mentioned later became subjects of those lives, and one was probably the very first life Plutarch undertook. The paired lives of the Theban general Epaminondas and the Roman general Scipio once opened the collection of parallel lives, but these lives, along with at least one other pair, were lost in the work's transmission. The metaphor of biography as mirror, a reflecting medium by which one sees and improves oneself, was to become central to Plutarch as he progressed through the lives, and deeply personal. It figures prominently in the opening sentence of the Aemilius Paulus, a passage that comes as close as any to being a mission statement for the lives as a whole. It first occurred to me to start the writing of lives for the sake of other people, but now I stick to it and make myself at home there for my own sake, seeking by means of history to adorn myself, just as though looking in a mirror, and to make my life conform to the virtues of those men. Plutarch goes on in this prologue to describe his biographical subjects as dining companions, welcomed sequentially into his home and marvelled at, as King Priam, in the final episode of Homer's Iliad, once marvelled at the beauty and power of Achilles. I take from the deeds of each the principal and finest things that allow me to get to know them, Plutarch writes. Plutarch's focus on the finest things among the deeds of great men might suggest that the lives supply only positive exemplars. But elsewhere, as in the prologue to Alexander, Plutarch speaks of the workings of virtue or vice, my emphasis, as the matter of his narratives, and indeed Alexander was a creature of very mixed parts, as was Achilles. The lives lean toward the positive in their portrayals of character and occasionally hide blemishes, but they are far from hagiographic, and their ranks include several figures Plutarch does not regard as admirable. Interestingly, the lives of these anti-heroes, among the Greeks Alcibiades and among the Romans Mark Antony, are some of the longest and richest of Plutarch's compositions, revealing a deeper engagement on the part of the author than the more positive portraits. "Nothing touches man but Plutarch feels it to be his," Emerson wrote in his introduction to the mid-19th century edition of Plutarch's works, overseen by his friend Arthur Hugh Clough. He is tolerant even of vice, if he finds it genial. In his journals, Emerson quoted approvingly Clough's judgment that Antony, the portrait of a dissolute, reckless charmer, was the very finest of all the lives. Plutarch had most likely returned to his native Chaeronea at the time he began the lives, probably near the end of the 1st century CE, when he was about 50. He had read widely in both Greek and Roman history by that time, so as to draw on a wide array of primary sources, some precise and reliable, others gossipy and anecdotal. Plutarch's wide range of source materials, his lack of discrimination in borrowing from them, and his insouciance with regard to the chronology and relative weight of the events he describes, makes the study of the parallel lives a frustrating pursuit for modern historians. But Plutarch never intended his work as a historical record. His own programmatic introduction to the Alexander serves once again as a valuable description of his technique. I shall make no other preface than to entreat my readers not to object if I fail to present exhaustive descriptions of all the famous actions of these men, but offer, for the most part, abridged accounts of them. For it is not histories I am writing, but lives, and the most glorious deeds do not always reveal the workings of virtue or vice. Frequently a small thing, a phrase or a flash of wit, gives more insight into a man's character than battles where tens of thousands die, or vast arrays of troops or sieges of cities. Accordingly, just as painters derive their likenesses from a subject's face and the expression of his eyes, where character shows itself, and attach little importance to other parts of the body, so must I be allowed to give more attention to the manifestations of a man's soul, and thereby mould an image of his life. Plutarch would remain in Chaeronea the rest of his long life, serving the town as magistrate and the nearby shrine of Delphi as priest of Apollo. He married, and his wife Timoxena had at least 5 children, among them 4 sons and a daughter who died in childhood. The death prompted Plutarch to compose one of his most moving essays, A Consolation to his Wife. He lived through the reign of Trajan, Rome's most beloved and successful emperor since the time of Augustus, and into at least the first few years of that of Hadrian. By the time he died, around 120 CE, the Roman Empire was well into an era that Edward Gibbon famously termed the most happy and prosperous in the history of the world. Happy and prosperous, too, was the life he had led, a life rooted in study of the past, service to gods and mortals, and the quest for self-improvement through the contemplation of great historical figures, a quest he bequeathed to others by writing the parallel lives. Modern listeners of Plutarch's Lives, however, are usually not seeking the moral self-improvement their author intended, but rather an immersion in the events of the classical past and an encounter with its greatest personalities. For this reason, nearly all recent editions of Plutarch's work, including the present one, have split up the paired lives and reorganized them into clusters to highlight different eras of history. This new scheme obscures the parallel part of the parallel lives and makes Plutarch's syncrasies, the comparative essays with which he prefaced each pair of lives, highlighting the ways that the characters of their Greek and Roman subjects might illuminate each other, all but irrelevant. But it allows a fuller exploration of a single place, time, and culture, and a richer sense of the historical context that surrounds its subjects than the original paired arrangement. That historically informed reading is very much the experience our Age of Caesar seeks to provide. Plutarch's portraits of the 5 men included here show them to be emblematic of an era when force of character and personal ambition determined the fates of armies, nations, regimes. The conflicts that dominated the period play out, in Plutarch's biographical scheme, as contrasts in character, first between Julius Caesar and Pompey, 2 proud, stolid warriors striving to master the energies unleashed by Rome's expanding empire and increasingly professionalized armies, then between Caesar and Brutus, the first a restless man of action, the second a pensive philosopher-statesman driven to take up arms by forces beyond his control. Amid these clashes, Cicero and Antony pursued less fixed agendas, ending up on opposing sides and bound, for no inevitable reason, on a collision of their own. These 2 complex figures, Cicero a politician always looking for self-advancement, and Antony a soldier driven by his lusts for combat, pleasure, and finally, ruinously, for Cleopatra, seem to have intrigued Plutarch most deeply. Their quirks, and especially in Antony's case, flaws, render them vividly, appealingly human. In a wonderful historical overview of the late Roman Republic by Mary Beard, we hope to make modern listeners feel at home in the world of the 1st century BCE and allow them to follow Plutarch's biographies in close detail. It is hoped that their enjoyment of the 5 nearly contemporaneous lives contained herein, those of Pompey, Caesar, Cicero, Brutus, and Antony, will not often be impeded by questions of terminology and nomenclature, questions that so often pose a barrier between ourselves and the classical world. There is further justification for presenting these 5 lives in a single volume, detached from their Greek parallels. As historian Christopher Pelling has convincingly shown, 4 of the 5, Cicero excluded, were composed by Plutarch at nearly the same time, based on a common set of source materials. Although the demonstrably earlier Cicero, we felt, had to be included because of its subject's historical importance, the remaining lives contained herein form a uniquely interconnected and unified set, bound together by frequent cross-references and by shared events and concerns. The lives of Cato the Younger and Marcus Licinius Crassus, which in Pelling's view may also have been part of this integrated project, were not selected for this volume, but the annotations highlight significant points where those lives overlap with or differ from the ones presented here. Among his many intellectual talents, Plutarch was a great prose stylist, and each new English version of his lives grapples with a challenge of his complex, highly structured Greek sentences. The team overseen by John Dryden in the late 17th century succeeded so admirably that their version remains in print today, though many of its idioms are now out of date, and the Greek text on which it was based has been revised by subsequent scholars. Pamela Mench's translation takes a sounder Greek text as its foundation, and brings Plutarch into line with modern usage, while still preserving much of the grace, solemnity, and elegance of the original. It is truly, we hope, a Plutarch for the 21st century. Emerson closed his introduction to Clough's edition of Plutarch in elegiac tones, foreseeing the enduring relevance of the author it enshrined. Plutarch's popularity will return in rapid cycles, he predicted. His sterling values will presently recall the eye and thought of the best minds, and his books will be reprinted and read anew by coming generations. and thus Plutarch will be perpetually rediscovered from time to time as long as books last. It is the hope of the editor and translator of this volume that, even if sterling values are no longer at the forefront of our presentation of Plutarch, the publication of our Age of Caesar will help make Emerson a true prophet. Introduction. Mary Beard. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March by the Roman system of dating, is the most famous political murder in history. Caesar had recently been made dictator for life, and he was killed in the name of liberty by a group of men that he counted as friends and colleagues. In the aftermath, the assassins issued coins with a design specially chosen to celebrate the deed and press home the message. It featured the memorable date, Ide Mar, a pair of daggers, and the image of the small hat, the cap of liberty, regularly presented to Roman slaves when they were granted their freedom. This was liberation on a grander scale, freeing the Roman people from tyranny. All the characters whose biographies feature in this collection had some role in the story of the murder. Julius Caesar was the victim, his dying moments vividly described by Plutarch. In this account there were no famous last words, et tu, Brute, or whatever. After a futile attempt to fight back, Caesar pulled his toga over his head and took the 23 dagger blows that killed him. Brutus was the leading figure behind the assassination, a frankly messy business, as Plutarch makes clear, with several of the assassins themselves caught in friendly fire, accidentally wounded by blows from their own side, and he was soon more or less forced to leave the city. Cicero, the Roman politician, philosopher, poet, wit, and orator, was not party to the plot, but was very likely an eyewitness of the murder, and was straightway consulted by the assassins about what on earth to do next. One of their main problems was that they had not thought ahead. Antony was Caesar's right-hand man, gave the address at his funeral, and tried to take on the role of Caesar's defender and successor, though he soon found an even more powerful rival for that position. Pompey, with whom this collection opens, was already dead by 44. He had been killed 4 years earlier in a civil war, leading those Romans who had then been prepared to resort to pitched battles to resist the growing power of Caesar. But his shadow hung over the assassination. Caesar was murdered in an expensive new meeting hall whose building Pompey had funded, and he fell in front of a statue of Pompey himself, splattering it with his blood. It was as if Pompey was finally getting his revenge. The death of Caesar has provided the template for assassination ever since, and has been the focus of debate on the rights and wrongs of political violence. In 1865, John Wilkes Booth used the word Ides as the code word for the planned date of the assassination of President Lincoln. Shakespeare, in his Julius Caesar, largely drawing on an early translation of Plutarch's biography, used the events of 44 BCE to reflect on the nature of political power, ideology, and moral conscience. Others have seen the assassination as a useful reminder of the futility of such attempts at direct action. For what did it achieve? If the assassins had really wanted to quash the rise of one-man rule in Rome, if they wanted to kill the tyranny as well as the tyrant, they were strikingly unsuccessful. More than a decade of civil war followed, a major theme in Plutarch's biographies of Brutus and Antony. But the end result was that Caesar's great-nephew, Augustus, as he was later known, the man who rivaled Antony as Caesar's heir, became the first Roman emperor. He established autocratic rule on a permanent basis. So much for the return of liberty. In the long history of Rome, founded, as the Romans themselves calculated it, around 750 BCE, the murder of Caesar, for all its later notoriety, was just one of many political crises that became particularly intense and violent in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. This was a period of expansion, political change, even revolution. It saw vast Roman conquests overseas and, as a consequence, an enormous influx of wealth into the city. Gleaming marble from Greece rather than local brick and stone now began to be used for temples and other public buildings in the city. Captive slaves started to make up the majority of the workforce, and so many people flocked to Rome that its population topped 1 million, the only Western city of that size until London in the early 19th century. But this age also saw repeated outbreaks of civil war at home, political disintegration, mass pogroms of citizens, and the final fracture of what had once been a more or less democratic system of government. As a leading politician, Caesar was almost typical in coming to a violent end. None of the men featured in this book died in their beds, nor fighting some barbarian enemy. They were killed in conflict with other Romans, by Roman hands or on Roman orders. Pompey, for example, after losing in battle to Caesar, was decapitated by an Egyptian eunuch, ably assisted by a couple of Roman veteran soldiers. Cicero was put to death in 43 BCE in one of the pogroms, on Antony's instructions, his head and hands later pinned up in the center of Rome as macabre trophies for the crowds to leer and jeer. A little over a decade later, Antony ended up killing himself after he had lost in battle to Caesar's great-nephew and successor. The Romans described and fiercely debated the stresses and breakdown of their political system, trailing all kinds of explanations and possible solutions. For this period was also one of intellectual revolution at Rome, when the rich tradition of Roman literature began. Starting in the early 2nd century BCE, Roman writers for the first time tried to tell the history of their city, to reflect on its problems and on how they thought it should be governed. And they used writing, too, for political attacks, insults in verse, self-advertisement in public, and for personal letters in which they shared their aspirations, fears, and suspicions. When Plutarch in the early 2nd century CE was writing these biographies, he could base his narrative on plenty of contemporary material from the age of Caesar. Some of this we can still read, including Caesar's own one-sided account of his campaigns against the tribes of Gaul and later against Pompey, one of the very few eyewitness descriptions of ancient warfare to have come down to us, and volumes of Cicero's political speeches, philosophical treatises, and hundreds of his private letters, made public after his death by his loyal heirs. This writing helps us to understand what underlay all that chaos. The rapid growth of the Roman Empire was one crucial and destabilizing factor. For us, why Rome grew in a few centuries from a small, moderately successful town in central Italy to one with control over more of Europe and the Mediterranean world than any state before or since, is one of history's big puzzles. Most modern observers put it down to some unfathomable combination of greed, a highly militaristic ideology, a dose of good luck, and a happy knack of converting those they conquered into Roman citizens, and so into new soldiers for the Roman cause. The Romans themselves were less puzzled on this score, pointing to the support of the gods, their own piety, and a succession of defensive rather than aggressive wars in which they intervened to protect allies under threat. They were more troubled by the consequences of overseas growth for society and politics back home. Despite their popular modern image, Romans were not simply thoughtless and jingoistic imperialists. Some worried that the wealth and luxury which came with conquest overseas undermined what they saw as old-fashioned, tough Roman austerity. A few about the cruelty of conquest. There was even one, perhaps not entirely serious, proposal to put Caesar on trial for genocide during his conquest of Gaul. Others faced the question of how to adapt the traditional structures of Roman government to cope with new imperial demands. For how could you control and defend a vast empire stretching from Spain to Syria with a power structure and a system of military command developed to run nothing more than a small town? That was one of the big issues behind the revolutionary changes of this period, and one of the factors that promoted the rise of dynasts such as Caesar. The political traditions of Rome, at least as far back to the end of the 6th century BCE, had been based on the principle that power was only ever held on a temporary basis and was always shared. The citizens as a whole elected the city's officials, who combined both military and civilian duties, held office for just 1 year at a time, ideally not to be repeated, and never had fully independent decision-making power. The fact that there had always been not one but two consuls, the most senior of these annual officials, is a clear sign of that long-established commitment to power-sharing. But it was a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?